Welcome to Conversation Ex Nihilo. This is Billy. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for all of your support with the last couple podcasts. I've got a lot of great feedback concerning Dr. Bakhtiari of the Baskerville Institute, as well as Michael Belford from the bands The Sleepers and Tuxedo Moon. Seems like those interviews struck a chord with some people. So, wow, thanks. Thanks for the outpouring of support. A lot of people have been asking, Billy, why you ran? I say, why not? It's time. It's time to discuss it. It's all over the news. Sometimes my heart just points me in a direction, and I got to start talking about it. Which brings me to today's guest. Today's guest is Sara Long. Sara is known as the makeup historian because she hosts a podcast of the same name in which she discusses history through the lens of cosmetics. It's really cool, actually, for a couple reasons. Number one, she is a real historian. But even if she weren't, right, it's still a really kind of a cool idea. It's one of those subjects where, admittedly, I know very little about that of cosmetics. However, as I mentioned in our interview, I think it is kind of important in that it influences culture heavily, doesn't it? I mean, how long have women been wearing makeup? How long have men been wearing makeup? I mean, just think of the makeup of the band Kiss and how much that influences a certain segment of our society ever since the 1970s. Makeup is a really big deal to a lot of people. So I think it's a very interesting topic, and I wanted to kind of talk to her a little bit about that, and she's got some really keen insights into it that she talks about on her podcast. She's also working on makeup conservation. Turns out, big surprise, there is not a lot of scholarship out there because makeup is one of those things that doesn't last very long, right? Unlike pots and spearheads and things like that, it tends to melt and lose its substance. So we talk a little bit about the founding fathers, founding mothers. I've been on a big kick lately to discuss those people because, as some of you know, I decided that I'm going to read a book about every single U.S. president. That's been a bit of a goal of mine. I just finished James Monroe. So the founding fathers are done. I'm moved on. I'm moving on from founding fatherville and moving into what the founding sons, right, or the founding nephews, maybe. That's where I'm at now. So I'm going to begin reading about John Quincy Adams coming up. So I kind of wanted to tie everything together by talking to a few guests about founding fathers. I'm going to have another one next week, too, to talk a little bit more about Jefferson. But Sara and I, we talk about Adams. We talk about, of course, his wife, Abigail Adams, which that relationship is incredible. You know, the funny thing is, as I've read these books, a lot of people ask, yeah, Billy, who's your favorite founding father now? I don't know if I have a favorite, but I do have to tell you that John Adams guy is pretty underrated. Very underrated. I think it's amazing that they put out that HBO miniseries. If you haven't seen it, you've got to check it out. It does him justice better than I think anything else could, other than the book that it was based on by McCullough. And as far as our founding fathers go, he was interesting insofar as he had a sense of humor and very self-deprecating, very cranky, very whiny. Some people think that he might have had Graves' disease, which might have contributed to his inability to keep his thoughts to himself. I love that, right? It's just kind of funny how, again, depending on how the historian himself views you, we get a different flavor for how these people were, even how tall they were. We discussed that a little bit in the beginning of this interview. This is going to sound a little bit all over the place, I realize, but you'll follow along. And, join the conversation on Twitter at ConvoXNihilo. Email me, billy@convoxnihilo.com. I'm interested in meeting some guests who have been impacted by the eviction moratorium ending. If you have a story to tell or know somebody who does, please get back to me. I'm still kind of collecting some stories for a segment called We Are Firing, in which I discuss people losing their jobs. I discuss the economy and things like that. So if you have a story, having been laid off, having lost your job recently, get in touch with me, and let's talk about maybe doing an interview either on or off the record. All right. Well, thanks again for listening, and enjoy my conversation with the makeup historian, Sara Long.
Let's go, watch it roll. We've got a lot of bottles and it's number gross. Hey, yo, here we go. We've got a bodies while we look so dope. We disturb the peace everywhere we go. We can get a kiss from almost every girl.
Just how tall was James Madison?
How tall was James Madison?
Let's just get right to it.
I'm not sure exactly. You really did go straight for it. I am not exactly sure the height of all of our founders.
I think I ask because I've noticed in my readings lately that depending on who you read, you get different stories about the founding fathers, don't you? It's like we just can't.
I would say that's accurate.
We cannot clear up some basic information about these fellows.
That's true. I mean, that's one of the unfortunate things about history is we're completely reliant on our sources and what we have available to us. And not everything is well preserved, especially some of those little minute details. I feel like that one might be preserved, though. I just don't know it.
Well, I mean, I do have kind of, I guess, a sillier reason for asking it because I've noticed, you have some biographies in which they will say that he was 5'6". That seems to be, those are the guys that liked him. And the historians who didn't, I've noticed it's as low as 5 feet. And I noticed how you can lose 6 inches depending on how a historian views your record.
That is really funny. I like that, actually. That's hilarious.
Isn't that ridiculous? I mean, I guess that's also a long way of asking, who are some of your favorite founding fathers or mothers for that reason?
Oh, for mothers, definitely Abigail Adams. I adore her. And the more I study her, the more I fall in love with her. She really was just well ahead of her time. I love one of my favorite letters of hers is when she writes to her husband, John Adams, and says, "Remember the ladies," in regards to the one of the first meetings of, really talking about the creating our nation. So I love that she stood up for the ladies. But in regards to our founding fathers, honestly, I feel like it changes every year that I study a new one. But I really love one of them. I think is probably expected, and then another one is probably a little bit controversial, but it's just my humble opinion. I obviously really love George Washington. I think he was well ahead of his time as well. I think he's also one of perhaps the most misunderstood of our founding fathers because he is so romanticized, because he was our first president, that we tend to forget the military side of him, the very gritty, tenacious, not so polished version of George Washington, and how in actuality a lot of people don't like to talk about this, but in regards to military history, he got very lucky. Many times I'm not saying that he wasn't incredibly intelligent and strategic, but there were many times where he just had quite a bit of luck as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I also think that's one of the most fascinating parts about his story, right? Is that he wasn't such a great general.
Yeah, it depends.
Brave, very brave. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in regards to strategy, he really didn't have as much experience as he wanted to have. He wanted to be a great soldier, a great general, and wasn't always given that opportunity because when he was fighting for the British in the French and Indian War, he was one of the colonists. So he wasn't always given those major opportunities that he desired. And then he realized that he was considered kind of second tier in comparison to the British Army because he was a colonist. And that definitely played into his kind of passion for the Revolutionary War as well.
Right. That built up a lot of resentment, didn't it?
It did actually.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm a proud American, and I'm kind of thankful for that. So.
And I also understand resentment very well.
Yeah.
So who's the other one?
Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, old TJ.
Yeah. He's very controversial. You know, definitely one of the more polarizing figures in regards to colonial American history. But I think something we tend to forget about a lot of our founding fathers and mothers is that they were real people. They're not
Mhm.
the romanticized version that we always tell our students about in the textbooks. They had flaws. They were navigating something completely foreign to them. So the fact that Jefferson had this forethought of what America should be like and American values and what he contributed to that, that's why I have a lot of respect for him. Obviously, he had flaws, just like
Mhm.
we all do, and there are blemishes to his story. But I mean, you know, he gave us the Declaration, like you know,
Well, I think
another.
it's so easy to view them through our present day lens, isn't it? And judge them accordingly.
I
It's
agree
much
with that.
harder to put yourself in their place, you know, and to try to understand the world through their eyes. I think about that a lot in his case as pertains to slavery. You know, I mean, his earliest childhood memory, right, was being carried by a slave. And I
Mm.
mean, I just think about how, you know, that's just his own personal history. That's where his history starts, is with slavery. And so of course it's not a very easy answer for him to try to figure out how to deal with it.
No, not at all. And a lot of that, I think that's another misconception. A lot of our founding fathers really had conflicting views from a moral aspect about slavery. Many of them disagreed with it on a moral level, but they didn't exactly know how to get rid of it overnight as much as they wanted to. And I think that's one of the most challenging parts about studying history is just the understanding of how important context is. Like how you were just saying, I think one of the ultimate mistakes people make when studying history is they look at a historical period through the lens of their own time. And you have to be very careful to go back to what were the cultural, political, economic realities of the time you're studying. And although it's, you know, completely ridiculous to us now, at the time, that was what was going on. And our founding fathers actually were very revolutionary just in their thinking because they didn't want it, but they just didn't exactly know how. And that's not something that we'll figure out as a country how to address until the Civil War. So,
Hmm.
you know, well, well down the road. But I think there's lots of misconceptions about our founding fathers. Many of them, I think it also contributes to the fact that it's not just the Great Awakening that is going on at this time, it's the Enlightenment as well. So they're being influenced by great religious movements, but also scientific movements. So they're kind of just completely in the mix of all of these different ideas. And I think it's so evident when you read through the Declaration, through our Constitution, just how they are conflicted and they want to change. They want to get rid of some of these major blemishes in society, but they don't have all of the answers at
Right.
that moment. They try though, and I think that's why they make, you know, our founding documents, our infrastructure, living documents. So I think
Right.
they had that forethought and hope that we as a country would figure out how to get rid of that.
Well, and so how do you personally put yourself in their place and kind of slough off the present day lens?
What exactly do you mean?
I
Like,
mean, in using your imagination as a professor, as a student of history, you know, how do you
mm,
personally go about empathizing with them, putting yourself in their place?
um, putting myself in their place, I think I empathize with them a lot in regards to how their religious views were impacting how they viewed the world. Because many, we would call them, some of our founding fathers, sources suggest that they were kind of more agnostic, that they
Mhm.
believed in a concept of a God, of a higher being, but they didn't exactly know which context. So they had that strong emphasis on morality, on good values, but they're being influenced by Enlightenment theory as well. So I think that I resonate with that a lot, especially as an academic and being exposed to lots of different ideas. Um, how that can really impact your view of the world and how you want to change, but you don't always know the right path. Sometimes because you have too many sources of information influencing you at that time. I hope that made sense. I hope I
Yeah, I
answered
think
your
so. And
question.
I think it's a tough question to answer too, right? I mean, for me, when I'm reading this stuff, I just think I have a powerful imagination. I mean, you almost have to read it in some ways like a novel. You almost have to put yourself in their place and allow them to be an avatar of sorts. And in so doing, do you find yourself identifying with any of them more than others?
Mm, I wouldn't say one of the founding fathers. I would go back to one of the founding mothers. I think I
Which one?
really,
Abigail?
Abigail, the more I read about her, the more I connect with her just because I think she felt so stuck. When you read her personal
Mm,
letters, she had such vision and she knew certain things were wrong and she had that tenacity, that grit. She wanted to change things, but because of the realities for different for men and women at that time, she was conflicted with her place within society, what she thought, but also what she thought it should be. So I think I connect with her the most because of how stuck I think she felt at that time,
hmm.
wanting to be respectful to her husband, to the way society was at that time, but also we tend to forget that these revolutionary ideas of the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment, they're not just impacting the men at that time.
Right.
They're impacting women, and women are starting to wake up and kind of think, hang on a minute, what is my place in society? Why we're talking about equality at these meetings, but who is that equality going towards? It's contradictory. So they're um, I think I resonate with her the most or can empathize with her the most because of
Hmm.
that feeling of feeling stuck. And I feel that way in many regards, especially as a female in academia, having, things that I would like to do in regards to my career, but also just as a young woman, there are things that I want. So it's, kind of balancing your own desires for your life and then also expectations of you as an academic. So I think I connect with her a lot more in that regard. If I had to choose one of the founding fathers, I think it would go back to George Washington just because of my recent research where I started to understand that there was this very different side to him that was not polished, but he was very good at being that symbol, being that representation. And I connect with that as well because as historians, we are not always very good at being transparent about the research process. We like for you to come in, read our book at the end when it's, we've done years of research, but we don't tell you really that often just how difficult it was to conduct that research or how much sacrifice went into that. Um, how historians usually are not really well liked because we're trying our best to tell the truth.
Yeah.
So there's a much more eloquent way to say it, but we tend to piss people off sometimes. And I'm just going to be real about it.
That's interesting. I guess I didn't think about it that much. Who are the people you think you tend to upset? Other academics,
Politicians.
politicians. Okay.
I would say politicians, especially now in our current day society and mainstream media. I'd say maybe like in the 80s, it was probably like 80s, 90s, maybe 60s and 70s as well. It was more politicians and lawyers, I think we upset. But now, considering that we're in this very interesting age in American history, I think we upset career politicians and mainstream media the most.
Hmm. Well, I mean, who gets licensed to use the myths of the founding fathers, right? I mean, I guess these people you described, they seem to me to be people who feel like they have ownership over the American myth for some reason or another. And I think it's something that we all have ownership in, don't we?
I would agree with you on that. And I think it's
Yeah.
an excellent question, and something that in all honesty, I'm only just now starting to research based off of, I think a lot of it has to do with the politics of publication, especially American history textbooks. That was something that was really new to me when I started working on my PhD. I didn't realize how much politics was involved in the publishing of our textbooks. So I think, to put it simply, if you really want to understand American history, you follow the money because we're a capitalist
Mm.
society. And you got to follow the money in regards to the publications. Who's really in control of the history books, who's in control of the narrative. And honestly, it isn't always the historians. And that was the sad part that I am kind of studying right now.
What kinds of things have you found out that have been very revelatory?
Well, it wasn't until the digital technology revolution that we started to see a huge change in regards to how American history textbooks were structured and how they were published or who was funding them. Really, prior to the digital revolution, it was one historian would write one giant narrative history, and it's just their voice. And although there's always some bias to that, obviously, at least it was a little bit easier to decipher and understand. But after we started to see the rise of digital technology completely consume our society and things going on with politics, um, American history textbooks started to be outsourced. So instead of giving one historian a contract or a royalty for just making that one giant textbook, each chapter was divided up to one different scholar and they get one flat fee. So, there's politics with the financial side, but then there's
Right.
also, um, I think it really harmed the narrative and made it, I think it was marketed in, it's to promote diversity, things like that, but it wasn't exactly diversity of thought. Um, so I think that was the biggest change that I've noticed.
There's a big controversy, wasn't there, about a Texas publishing company that was putting out most of the textbooks, right?
Hmm. Yes.
Where are we on that? Any idea? It's been a while since I read about that, but I remember the controversy was something about how most of the textbooks that are used in elementary and high school are coming out of, one or two companies, and they're in Texas, right? And so there's this, we're kind of getting history distilled in a Texas viewpoint. Now, I have family in Texas. That's the last thing I think any of us need, is to hear their viewpoints.
No. From
They're
my
teachers too, by the way. It's just something I don't think is good for America at large.
to only hear one at the narrative from one state.
Exactly, like to get, I mean, I don't really mean to disparage Texas specifically, but I do think that, to get one region's point of view disseminated throughout the whole land seems a bit silly to me.
Hmm. I think that was primarily going on in the 80s, if my research is correct, and I think that had a lot to do with the Reagan Revolution and the rise of that version of conservatism at that time. But in regards to the past 10, 15 years, I think three states have really emerged. Texas is still one of them, but also California and New York now have, I think all three of them kind of have a monopoly on our textbooks and the way that they're being published, because they are coming out of just a few select giant publishers, but they're being produced primarily within these three states. So, and that leads to bigger questions about political intentions and things like that. But I agree with you. I think to have it just so condensed like that and a borderline monopoly is not good. And it raises questions about, is what's in our textbooks, is that what it really is? Or, what voices are being left out and not preserved?
Well, and I mean, and that leads to a question I've been thinking a lot lately as an educator myself. Do we need textbooks? Period.
That's really weird you say that, because I've been pondering that same question, especially the past 6 months, as I've been creating, revamping my own classes. The more textbooks I read, I'm not happy with them. I think they're skewed, they're biased, there's things missing. They're not as reliant on true primary sources. And it's funny you say that, because I've been pondering the same question.
In your research, in your educational travels, have you come across Neil Postman or read any of his stuff?
I haven't, actually.
It's funny. I discovered him by accident too. His name never came up in my grad program either. And I'm shocked, to be honest with you, because he was a fantastic thinker. He died, I think, in 2000. 2008 maybe. And so a lot of his writing is confined to the 80s and 90s when he put out the bulk of his research. So in other words, it doesn't touch a lot on the digital age,
Mhm.
just barely before he passed away. But one of his revolutionary ideas is that we should just get rid of textbooks. And his thinking was much along the line of what you mentioned, that they, between those pages, you can only fit so much information, and you have to constantly question the point of view of the person writing it. And it's just not necessarily the best way to get students to think. It's
Mhm.
not the best way to get them to discover. In fact, most of the time it's horrible. So let's just get rid of them, is his idea. And I think it's a great idea.
Honestly, I would agree. As I progress in my own teaching career, I'm starting to think that they're a crutch, and I don't like them. And especially because so many of my students grew up on technology, I think that as educators, there's lots of different ways we can be challenging them in a healthy and productive way where we can use the textbook, but I don't think we have to be completely reliant on it and create the whole class specific, like just kind of a summary of what's in the text. I think we've almost done our students a disservice by that, by not challenging them, by not helping them. Personally, I think it's kind of ironic that in our education system, one of the top skills we always say your students will leave with is the ability to think critically. But I don't think that's actually happening.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I'm a little I'm I'm not I feel like we shouldn't be telling people that because what I think
False
creating,
advertising. We should be sued for that.
yeah, because well, and honestly, maybe because so many, especially in regards to history, by the time they get to my class and at the college level, they're kind of thrown off because I have a personal, I don't like multiple choice tests. I think they're
Right.
ridiculous. I
Yeah.
don't like them. I think all it does is create test takers. It doesn't create scholars, and it creates people who are focused on grades, not education. And
Totally.
so I never use a multiple choice test. Like we could all memorize dates, and I could ask you when was the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment ratified? Or I could ask you to tell me the difference between the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. Then you're going to
Hmm.
have to actually know what the context was, and they're not the same thing. That's a common, misconception. So I don't like that our education system is just creating, I think it's creating complacency, complacent um, citizens who do not really criticize or think critically as much as they should. And we reward people who get good grades, who are good test takers, but not
Right.
the free thinkers. We don't really reward diversity of thought.
You're absolutely right. And I think those people who think that way are usually not the ones who end up teaching. The ones who end up teaching are the ones who mechanically answer those multiple choice questions well, typically, which I think
Yeah,
is also just sad, you
I
know.
would agree with you on that.
Because it's fun. I worked with a social studies teacher recently, very young, who just graduated college not so long ago. And I mean, the lack of knowledge that this young lady had was just appalling, I thought, you
Hmm.
know. I mean, for example, having a conversation about John Adams, her takeaway from him was like he was a bit of a dick. Like that's
Oh,
it. That's all she could really conjure up in
well, that's
reference in history.
surprising because he did quite a bit.
I thought so too, and also what surprised me about it, we were talking about watching the miniseries. We watched that with some of our students, and so even though after she had seen this, that's all she was able to kind of communicate.
Really, I like that one. I think,
Oh, it's great, wasn't it?
yeah,
Yeah,
that's one of my,
finally giving that guy his due a little bit, and Abigail for that matter.
yeah, exactly. I'm
Yeah,
really shocked that that's what she said. Especially because the letters of John Adams and Abigail Adams are some of the best preserved primary
oh yeah,
sources we have, and they're private letters. So we get the understanding of the intimate everyday realities that we don't always get from someone like Hamilton, or where it's
right,
much more about like public. The sources we have were much more public, bigger publications. And it wasn't until much later that the family started to share more about Hamilton's everyday life. But in regards to Adams, part of the reason they were even able to create that whole miniseries was because of the
Right.
vast amount of sources we have from him. I'm really surprised.
Right.
That's sad. I don't like
It
that
is.
she.
No, I don't either. And I don't mean to put her down. I thought of it more as, it's not like she was an unintelligent person. It was that she was the consummate test taker. She was the one that can show up and take tests very well, but she could
Mhm.
not derive any sense of great meaning from the things that she was taught. And I
Yeah,
just thought of that as just a little sad.
I agree with you. It's sad. And then there's a part of me that also is not surprised because my guess is you said she was kind of young. So we
Mhm.
probably were in this system, around the same time and we're experiencing the same type of political or um, cultural realities within our departments, especially if, she's in the humanities as well. And unfortunately it wasn't until I started teaching that I started to realize my own education was quite skewed, and I don't
Mm,
really think it's intentional. It's not to place, to attack the department that I was at, because I did go to a phenomenal school and it does have really strong historians to this day. But in regards to how I got my master's, the question I had to answer for my comprehensive exams, it was so biased and so skewed. And then it wasn't until I started actually teaching American history that I realized not once did I ever have to know the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. I
right.
never had to take any test, never had to write anything about it. It was always just kind of understood. And then that, kind of opened Pandora's box and I realized, hang on a minute, there's a lot I still need to research in order to really help my students to be a strong educator. Just because I wasn't given it doesn't mean that I should sit around and complain. It means as a scholar,
Right. Right.
I need to get to work.
I
And
love I love that outlook, and I think you're absolutely right. That we could sit around and dwell about the negative side of it, or we can use that as kind of a call to action for our own personal uh, academic
yeah,
journeys, right?
I would agree with that. I like that, a call to action, because it really should be.
Yeah,
I don't, my biggest pet peeve is people who sit on the sidelines and complain about something, but then when you ask them, well, what should we do? They never have a
right.
suggestion and they like to complain. It drives me
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah. Me too. I don't like to discuss problems without having some idea of a solution, even if it's a bad idea. I'd like to have some notion of where we
Mhm.
can go in some direction we can go in. But maybe this will be a good point to then ask about your own history a little bit. When was it that you decided that history was the way for you to go?
It was a journey. I wouldn't say that I, thought about it like it just instantaneously and was like, this is what I need to do. I think it was a slow and developed love for history. And my love for history really comes from my dad. My dad is, I may have the title, but he's the real historian in my opinion,
It's
because
great.
of what he taught me and just his respect and love for it, for studying. And when I was 14, um, I was lucky enough to go on a trip to China with my dad, and we saw, we went to the Great Wall, the Forbidden City, the Terracotta Soldiers. We went at all sorts of different places, and it just opened my mind to there's so much in the world, and it's kind of fostered that love for education and traveling and history, and that never really went away. And then but the next big thing where I was kind of like, I think I maybe this could be my career, maybe I could do something with this, was when I my very first class that I ever took in college was United States history. But and it was a 3-hour class, a giant lecture hall, but my instructor was so passionate about it and had so much respect. He didn't use any PowerPoints. He just talked for
Mm,
3 hours. And I've still to this day, I think about him a lot because he kind of set the bar. Like that's what I would like. I want to be that person for my students. I'm trying to reach that as an educator because he just knew so much. And especially now, after acquiring my own education, I realized just how strong he was because he didn't just know the textbook narrative. He went and did his own research. He tried to figure out what were the intimate aspects of these major figures in American history? What was their everyday life like? What was their story? How did they get there? So I think the more I reflect on it, the more I can understand now just how much of an impact it had on me. So that was kind of where that love and the idea that maybe I could turn this into a career came from. And then I just kept taking more and more history classes. And then when it was time to transfer, it was the only thing I really loved and that made me happy. So, I mean, I
That's
won't
great.
lie, my parents were kind of like, what are you going to do with the history degree?
Yeah,
um, but, I think one of the most profound takeaways from studying history is this realization of just how short your time on earth really is. And it didn't make sense to everyone else, but to me, it simply just made me happy. And I just kept going with what made me happy.
that's great.
Yeah.
Because you're known as the makeup historian.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's my nickname, which has now become the name of my own podcast. But it derives from my really random career transition because the love and the passion for history was much more of a private thing that was developing, and I wasn't truly public about it until I got to Cal State Fullerton when I was like, this is my major. But at 18 years old, I started working professionally as a makeup artist. So to my friends and family, that was what I did. I was a makeup artist. I worked for different companies and I loved it. But then, I transferred to Fullerton and I was like, I think I'm gonna go for history. And they were like, what? That doesn't make any sense. So it's kind of weird. The more I reflect on it, I realize that these two journeys of makeup and history really started around the same time, about like 18 years old. Um, and I just kept pursuing the things that made me happy. And eventually they kind of melded into one thing when I got to grad school, because I realized that cosmetic history was something that really was not well researched. It was difficult to preserve. There wasn't a lot of discourse on it. So then I tried to make my thesis about cosmetic history and there just wasn't enough sources, but the whole intention behind that contributed to people calling me the makeup historian, because they were just so confused, like, how are these two random worlds melding right now?
I
And
think it's very interesting. What did you discover while you were doing some of the research, as scarce as the information may be?
well, my research originally started with trying to understand the history of red lipstick. And because red lipstick, a painted white face, and black eyeliner are three of the oldest cosmetic trends, and they've lasted. Basically, they've transcended time and they've transcended borders. So, as a scholar, that was really interesting to me. Why are these three trends still showing up in different countries and throughout different times that are very, very different? Maybe they have a different religious infrastructure, different government styles, but these three trends are still standing the test of time. So why is that? And then for the thesis, I tried to make it about red lipstick because taking on all three would have been too daunting
Right, right.
for that time and for that length of a project. But unfortunately, the more I continued on in the research, I realized that it's obvious now, but I was so passionate about it at the time, I didn't realize it, that makeup is perishable. It's not made to last. So, from a historical perspective, that's really challenging because we completely rely on our sources. So, I was not I didn't always have the actual red lipstick. I had paintings or letters, things that suggested red lipstick existed at that time, but never the actual product.
Hmm.
So that made it really challenging to write a thesis, and I wasn't able to write my thesis about it. But then it also helped me realize, it helped me get into conservation and to realize that I could do more to preserve cosmetics now for future scholars. So the makeup historian may be like my nickname, but part of having it be the title of the show and continuously saying it is to almost manifest that one day it a makeup historian could be a real thing, that someone could get a degree in history and specialize in cosmetic history. I don't know if I'll truly be able to do it in my lifetime, but I definitely think I can do my part to preserve sources, to give that to future generations, because I do think it's something that a lot of scholars tend to overlook, is like, oh, that's not very credible, or why are we just talking about fashion? But it
Well, it says a lot about culture at large, doesn't it?
exactly, I
Yeah.
think it prompts much bigger discussions, because men and women have, there's so much emotion tied to cosmetic practices, and it's such a reflection of the much more intimate aspects of everyday life that are not easy to preserve. So I think it's an indirect way, but a creative way to try to preserve that and get a more comprehensive historical narrative.
I actually do think that stuff is very interesting, actually. I mean, I don't know why, but sometimes I do find myself thinking about, like, well, when did men stop wearing makeup, right? I mean, they used to. You see it
They
portrayed
did.
in film all the time, from the 1700s especially. Um,
Hmm.
like, any insight into that as to why one gender starts and then stops, even with hair, long hair, short hair? I mean, with women, it seems like long hair has always been mostly the dominant trend throughout. At least, I mean, I'm just guessing here, but with men, it varies, right?
It does. I think it varies, and we see the biggest shifts in men versus women during times of economic struggle. So usually during times of war, or during a depression or a recession, when they're cosmetics are, that's not some, that's like a something you engage in. It's a luxury. It's not always, it hasn't always been something for every socioeconomic class. So I think in times when there's been economic or political upheaval, the emphasis is just on surviving, not on makeup or any cosmetic industry for that matter. So I think that's when we start to see it die down. And then sometimes those, that just sticks and it doesn't really make a comeback. But it's an excellent question, and one that I'm not entirely sure how to answer very well right now.
I think I think you kind of did, in a way. I can automatically imagine, right? Like, you're rich, your culture is rich, you don't have any wars. Might as well just fluff up your hair, put a bunch of makeup on your face. Might
Mhm.
as well. What else are you gonna do with your money and your time and your vanity?
Yeah, but there is another aspect to it that I think is interesting, that for both men and women, not just makeup. I mean, the term cosmetic really refers to anything that has to do with altering the appearance of your body. So the Smithsonian, their cosmetic history section, it includes like hair care, skin care, tattooing. I would even go so far as to now include cosmetic surgery,
Hmm.
things like that. When we use the term cosmetic, there's lots of different things we could be referencing, but something I think that's interesting for both men and women is different cosmetic trends. There's so much symbolism connected to them. And within the 20th century, especially, cosmetic trends were used for different movements to symbolize different intentions. And it wasn't just about beauty, there was now political symbolism behind it as well. For example, I mean, the flappers in the 1920s, red lipstick, they used that,
Hmm.
that was a symbol for embracing female sexuality and kind of taking back agency in that. But I think that's an interesting part of it too. There's so many questions though that I hope I get to research throughout my career.
No kidding. Do you think you have a special era, time that you are more of an expert in than others?
um I really have fallen in love with the Gilded Age because I think it connects so closely to what we're dealing with right now, and also the depression in regards to what's going on with our economic realities at the
Mm.
time right now. I can't remember exactly where I read it, but there I did read not too long ago that a historian had an opinion that those who are living through a time are the best to write about it. So even though there will be an inherent bias, I think I wasn't really thinking about it, but now I'm starting to realize that the things I'm living through right now, that's probably what I will be an expert on. But I don't even like the word expert. It kind of
I don't
bugs me.
either. I don't like that word either, but I can't think of a better one.
No,
Well,
no.
I read Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, that big 1,000-page tome by William Shirer. And he said something about that in the foreword because, he had lived through it and he was in Berlin pretty
Mhm.
much throughout the beginning of the Nazis' ascent to power. And he said that he had a lot of reservations about writing about it because he thought that he was too involved and that he should, wait.
Yeah.
And it was his friends and colleagues that convinced him, no, you're the right one to write about it. You experienced it. You must do it. And so he eventually relented and wrote what is considered to be one of the most comprehensive books about what was happening in Germany at that time. So I'm with you. I think you got to write about your time. You have to, even though
Yeah.
it seems a little bit odd as a historian to do so.
It's almost counterintuitive because we put such an emphasis on objectivity. And one of the
Yeah,
first things we train history students to do is to identify any potential bias. So it's hard because it's like, yeah, I want to write about what I'm living through and my own experiences as a young woman in academia and not always fitting the mold of what
right.
academia wants me to be. Um, of course, I want to write about that, but then the historian in me is like, well, I know I have a particular bias, but I also have a voice that is at risk of not being preserved. So
Certainly. What
it's
kind of mold do you think they have for you?
well, um, I'm trying to think of how to say this without getting in too much trouble.
Right. I know the feeling, believe me.
But the way I was raised, my own religious beliefs, my own political beliefs, I'm not the standard. I'm not the traditional scholar that, especially millennial scholar, that is being kind of produced by our education system, in my opinion. And I also have a unique philosophy, which I think it's sad that it's unique, but I think it's an abuse of my authority and my influence as an instructor to project my own beliefs on my students. Call me crazy, but I want them to think for themselves.
It's a radical idea.
Yeah, right. But in academia right now, that's one of my main critiques with some of my other scholars is that I know far too many instructors who do think it's their place to project their own beliefs on their students. And I would argue that's indoctrination in my opinion.
Yeah.
I know who I am and I know my core values, know what I stand for and stand against, but I also respect my students. And I'm a big believer that you have to give respect in order to receive it. So I tell my
Ah,
students
yes.
all the time, I'm never going to be mad at you or come at you for having a different opinion. But as a historian, you need to back up what you're saying with evidence, just like how I would for my beliefs. But that's why I'm always a little cautious to really reveal my political standing or religious views in an interview because my students, they're not just there for that class. They very well could go look up an interview, and I don't want them to ever feel that they have to write a certain way or, turn in an assignment a certain way just so that way Professor Long gives me an A. Like,
Yeah, I
I,
completely understand. And I certainly wouldn't want to pry into those parts of your life because I don't think it has any bearing on what kind of a scholar you are. I completely agree with your point of view in that I would want students to think for themselves. I do think that it's very difficult to be objective. And the older I get, I think the less I even care about objectivity in any fashion. But I think the idea is that we need to be able to think for ourselves to, kind of suss out the truth for ourselves. Really, at the end of the day, that's all we can do, right? I mean, so to be a complete fly on the wall of history is almost impossible, right? We were taught to tie it back to the beginning of this podcast. I think it's impossible to read about any aspect of history and not have some sort of present lens, not have some sort of it. I think the idea is to try to at least, understand as much as we can through their eyes, but how can we extract meaning from it that is relevant today? And we can only do that by, being a little bit subjective.
Mhm. And I agree. As I get older, I don't always think when I was in getting my degrees, the A biased was like the worst thing ever. And we always were taught to strive for complete objectivity, which is impossible to do,
Right.
but obviously you strive for that as a historian. But now as I get older, I don't I don't think having a particular leaning or a particular bias is always as horrible as it was made out to me as a student. Sometimes I think it is necessary because you bring something new to the table. And even though someone may not like your viewpoint, it's still a real viewpoint that needs to be preserved and understood and included in that discourse. And that's also, it strikes me odd that that's something that's really being fueled within our history programs right now, because in history you have to have thick skin. We fight with each other all the time. Like
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
lots of different views, but I'm noticing that historians that are emerging now, to me they seem a lot more soft,
Mm.
and like they don't really have as thick of skin. They lead with more emotion rather than logic. And there's also a contempt for a difference in opinion that I never truly experienced as a student. I remember being in classes at Cal State Fullerton, and it's history. We talk about really difficult things at times,
Yeah.
and we would have really heated discussions, debates about stuff, but then would leave and still be fine because we respected each other. That's not happening anymore in history classrooms, and that's something that's a little alarming and scary to me, because now if I'm noticing that when students disagree with each other on a, even on a historical opinion or perspective, it's a complete demonization of of the person who thinks differently from them. And in my opinion, that's not good historical research or historical discourse.
It's not good
I'm
manners. I mean, what?
Yeah, but I don't really like how this like how I was mentioning earlier. I believe that you have to give respect in order to receive it.
Certainly.
And I think that's something that's really important and necessary in history. But I'm alarmed that it's not really happening all that often, especially within the past 4 years. I think it's gotten worse.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because that young lady I was talking to you about earlier, who is a teacher who worked for me, that was another problem that I noticed, was that she expected respect immediately based
Mhm.
upon her title and her degree. And that's just not, I mean, I was the principal of this school, and I did not feel like I deserved any respect just because I had a title. I felt like every single student that walked through that door, I had to earn that respect, you know?
Yes, I would agree with you.
It just is natural to me. And I don't know if it was a product of her education. I'd like to be generous and say that it is, that I think it was just how she was taught. And I think, but she must have been not so much younger than you. It's just one individual. But I also feel like, there's no secret that we've been talking a lot about these issues with the millennial generation, of which I am a part of, just on the older end. Um, and the softness and the expectations, I think that they're raised to expect a little bit too much by and large. I mean, and I'm including myself in that. Again, I'm on the older end, but I think that I could have easily fallen into those same traps. It's just not the way I think.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, and something I've actually been thinking about a lot, because as a millennial myself, I feel highly misunderstood, but I also agree with you that there are a vast majority of millennials who do have that entitlement. And I think a lot of it has to do with being raised on digital technology and being accustomed to instant gratification, and
Yeah.
also attacking people from the safety of a computer screen. Millennials really haven't had to face like immediate consequences for attacking someone's reputation, or just being flat out mean to someone
Right.
online. But then from a historical perspective, let me start with this. I think millennials are running the world right now, but that they don't know they're running the world. And the moment they wake up, I really think the entire game will change, because millennials have a very unique place in the context of world history. We were the last generation to ever experience growing up in an analog world.
Yeah.
We were simultaneously the first to ever experience growing up in a digital world. So there's really, I don't think there ever will be another generation who truly approaches problems like millennials. But, and I think that entitlement comes to we're almost asleep. I think once we wake up, and especially in regards to how we've been hit in regards to finances, how difficult millennials have been hit with different financial struggles. I think when we wake up, the game will really change. But I think the digital technology, immediate gratification, I really believe that connects to a lot of the entitlement. I don't like when people say it, but I also don't think they're wrong. I'm aware that it happens a lot with millennials.
I think that's such a great way of putting it too. I truly do. I'm very fond of this quote that's often attributed to Thomas Jefferson. It's ridicule is the only weapon against unintelligible ideas, which I love. However, I feel like that is being used, and now every idea is worthy of ridicule. You know, there's no distinction between the unintelligible ones and the cogent ones. It's just ridicule, ridicule, ridicule is the constant weapon.
Yeah.
It's the language of this modern technology.
Mm-hmm. And I think because of that, we've done a huge disservice to our students right now, because really the message, especially with what's going on in politics and in the mainstream media, I think the message we're sending students is that if you disagree with anyone or have a different upbringing, different opinion, there's absolutely no room for compromise. You can't find common ground. You can't fix the most pressing issues in our society. And that's absolutely asinine. It really is. It's that diversity of thought, having different viewpoints come to the table. That's when we fix the most pressing issues in our society. But I think educators are so focused on they're projecting their own beliefs, in all honesty, that they're forgetting we need to set an example for our students about how to really interact in society, how to come together. We talk about it all the time. You know, we love to think that we're doing big social justice things, and but we're not. And we can see that when we look at our students, because they don't know how to talk to each other. They don't know how to compromise. They don't have critical analysis skills. And it's not to be mean, it's just to be honest.
Right,
They
right.
don't. And I think as educators, you know, it's kind of like, all right, we can sit here, acknowledge it, complain about it, but now let's get to work. Let's wake up. Let's teach our students how to do that by setting an example. You know, not turning away from the interviews or debates that make us uncomfortable, only talking to people who confirm what's going
Right,
on in our
right.
own echo chamber. We need to talk to people who are very different from us and show our students that you can find common ground. You can come together. You can fix things going on in society. But a lot of educators are not doing that, in my humble opinion, right now.
I think that's so sad. I don't really want to be surrounded by people who only agree with me. It just
I
doesn't.
agree, exactly.
And that's
I
one of the reasons why I hired that teacher, by the way, because she was so opposite to me in so many ways. I wanted I wanted that. I wanted somebody who was a little bit different, who was younger and who thought maybe a little bit more rigidly than I did. I thought it would be a good mix for the school.
I agree, and I think that's important. Having it's what bugs me a lot with especially the college application system. I'm pretty sure almost every college in our country now has you have to provide a diversity statement. Um,
What is
but
that?
I actually didn't have to do it, but I remember my sister having to do it. I have a younger sister. She had to provide a diversity statement for her nursing application. And I think it's something along the lines, you know, how are you going to promote diversity in the institution? But so many students their diversity is in regards to their identity and not how they think. And I think that is just the ultimate oxymoron for when you are going into an institution of higher education where there's supposed to be diversity of thought, but it's not. It's diversity of appearance, it's diversity of all the different ways. It's identity politics at its
Yeah.
finest, and
Yeah.
not, it's also, in my opinion, the fact that so many scholars are agreeing on one common narrative, to me, should, it's the ultimate red flag that there is censorship, there is coercion, there is manipulation going on in academia, and scholars really aren't able to truly produce real research anymore, in my opinion, because they're so focused on getting tenure, getting a certain publication, maintaining their job. And kind of just like how you were mentioning earlier about how I don't know if I need a textbook. Sometimes as a scholar, I think I don't know if I need an institution to
Mm.
be a scholar. And I know that's a really polarizing and probably controversial opinion, but it is a thought I have every so often. Do I really need that validation to be a historian? Or it's
No, I'll answer that now. No, 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 you don't. And that's one of the most beautiful things about this modern age. The emperor has no clothes, and I really felt that way after COVID. I feel that way with the ascendancy of YouTube and the internet. I mean, the bottom line is, you could watch Harvard lectures for free, right? I mean, that's just the facts. That's we never were able to do that before, instantly and for free. And so, in many ways, I feel like that just exposes that the institutions don't have the power that they used to. They just don't.
mm-hmm. I would agree with that entirely. And it's really sad. I'm not saying that. I know some people think we should just completely get rid of them, and I'm not on that side. But I do think that there needs to be that there is major problems going on in our educational system, because it's not about education anymore. Education is a business. It's about
Yeah.
money. That's the
Yeah.
brutal truth about it. Um,
At
you,
every level, from
every
preschool through PhD.
mm-hmm. I agree with that entirely, especially because I got into, I wouldn't say trouble, but I got some feedback or like pushback because I'm in the process of working on my PhD right now at Claremont Graduate University. So it's interesting to be a teacher and a student during COVID. And I think that's
Yeah.
why I also have a very particular opinion about this. But it was for my first semester at Claremont that I did the research about the textbooks and the politics, and I don't know if I really need the textbook anymore, but in my final presentation, I said, I think historians in particular should really look into self-publication. And that didn't go over well.
Really?
Yeah, there was quite a bit of like, I don't know, because it's like, well, hang on a minute, if you're on your own, then you're not you're not compliant with the big history publishers, the big history journals. You're not writing what they want you to write. You're not thinking the way they want you to think. But that's the point of being a scholar, in my opinion. Could I do it? Yeah. I did it for my master's. I wrote the papers people wanted me to write. I got the degree, only to realize that I didn't get the full story. And I think as a scholar, it's important for you to not be afraid to be independent and to go against the grain from time to time when necessary.
Oh, I totally agree. And that's another thing I think from studying the founding of this country. One thing I've taken away from that is, from Adams, Jefferson, Madison, the big, big, big thinkers of the time, self-publish.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that I think was just the way it worked back then, of course. But however, no shame in that. No shame in the biggest minds of their time just saying, I'm publishing my own pamphlet and distributing it myself. What is wrong with that? That's brilliant.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And especially we have so many, this is something that also baffles me about what this current age we're living through is because of technology. We have access to more resources than any other generation in human history, but we choose not to look into them. We choose ignorance. And that because it's comfortable. It fits our narrative. It's what the mainstream media is saying. I'm not going to get pushback. But to me, that's also very counterintuitive to being an American.
I agree.
I'm also kind of surprised too that right now my emphasis at Claremont is museum studies. I really would love to focus on building museums and working with different institutions. But for a moment there, I was thinking about maybe going back to American history because I love it. And I I don't think I'll ever stop researching American history. But when I said that, there was a little bit of pushback like, do you really, like American history was kind of looked down upon as not important because of American imperialism and, kind of this, I don't know, that was very strange to me. And I'm not exactly sure what that means. I'm just kind of relaying my observations.
I understand. I sense it myself. The generation I was a part of for sure is very like anti-authoritarian. Maybe not generation, but my clique, my group of people. Raised on a steady diet of punk rock music and whatnot. It's very anti-authoritarian, and therefore the founding fathers were just a bunch of dicks, flat out. And I don't think I don't think I fully appreciated them until much later and started researching them on my own and started looking at them as fully formed human beings, flawed human beings, but started to really appreciate what they were up against and what they did. And like, for better or worse, just the good things about this country would have never come about had they not did what they did. We can't look at them as just dicks, for lack of a better, that thinking was no good for me. And I had to overcome that myself. So I think your observations are very accurate. A lot of people just don't even want to know. They don't want to know. It's too easy to dismiss them as slave owners, misogynistic, rich landowning dicks. Again, that word just seems so appropriate in so many ways, but they were more than that, weren't they?
So much more than that. And I mean, of course, obviously, like you were just saying, they were real people. They weren't perfect. They made mistakes, but their accomplishments were some of the most amazing accomplishments in all of world history. And it's because of the Constitution. It's because of that revolution. It's because of the ideas of all of those who paid the ultimate sacrifice to defend America and American values that as a young woman, I can be a professor. I can teach you American history. And I don't take that lightly at all. So it's like, in all honesty, that kind of pisses me off that founding fathers, like, I know they're not perfect, but like, damn.
What I love about them too is like they didn't even like each other most of the time. That is not emphasized enough, right? Is that they argued constantly.
All the time.
Yeah. And so we're talking about this idea of like, if you don't agree with me, fuck you, essentially. Well, we wouldn't have the country that we have if they all agreed with each other. Some of them hated each other. I mean, to the point where they killed each other in the case of Hamilton and Burr. I mean, for God's sakes, we can't just be around people who agree with us constantly. Even though you and I have been doing a lot of agreeing today, maybe we shouldn't be running the country. We need a few other people to join this conversation and dissent a bit. But I think you see my point. We need that.
And that's the other part too that I don't like of the revolutionary era being so romanticized is we forget that a lot. We forget just how much debate, how much controversy, because there was still to this day no other country who did what we did, who started the way that we started, who had that opportunity. There was no blueprint for the founding fathers. They're figuring everything out as they go. They're referencing history, but also just into regards to our government structure. So many people today think America is a strict democracy. We're not. We're a blend of a democracy and a republic. Our founding fathers took different pieces of these government structures and blended them into our own unique version. That wasn't done before. That's the type of ingenuity and forethought that I think should really be respected and not just, thrown to the wayside because of whatever
political opinions.
That day. I don't know.
Oh, that's great. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor. Thank you.
amazing things. Yeah, it's not a problem how many noise we bring.